Brian Gregory here, the Highland Church of Christ, get another Feel Good Friday. Now, a few weeks ago, there was a sudden storm that blew across the mid-state area. The winds blew up to 75 miles per hour in some places, and I recall making coffee to go outside to drink on the back porch with my wife, and within that 2-minute time span that it took to make the coffee, the wind had dramatically picked up. And we initially thought that a tornado was about to happen because there were some just really ominous, dark, low-hanging clouds. And we rushed to secure things under the back porch, and almost as soon as we did, the wind was over and the rain came. And within that 5-minute time span, there was a whole lot of widespread damage, and a lot of things were happening, such as trees falling down, and the power went out during that time. We lost our power for a total of 26 hours, and that night, of course, it was dark, it was hot, humid. Needless to say, it was uncomfortable. And what did we want? When it's dark like that, one of the very first things you want, of course, is light. We always find ourselves, anytime the power's out, one of us inevitably, myself usually, I'll go into a room, it's totally dark, the power's been out for a while, and what's the first thing I do? I find myself reaching to flip on the light switch. Every single time, I always laugh at myself when this happened. That night, of course, when we realized the power wasn't coming back on anytime soon, we scrambled for flashlights, and we learned just how quickly how unprepared we personally were for an extended outage. You know, when it's dark, light becomes really the most important thing. When I was a kid, I recall going camping with a friend of mine for the first time, and I was absolutely terrified. I was all fine with this until the sun started going down and it actually started getting dark. And of course, when you're in the woods, of course, it gets darker than it does outside of the woods. So it's getting darker, the darkness is closing in. I remember being tasked with gathering firewood and coming back with a couple of pieces of wood, and my friend complaining about how that wasn't enough. And really the truth was, I was just honestly scared, terrified of all of this. I remember we ended up going back to his house early that night. A few months later, I ended up having a camp out with a few more friends of mine at my house this time. And I remember that what we did was something very, very different. This time I went in with a lot of knowledge on the front end. I read a book about camping out. I was very, very prepared for this. And one of the things I remember is how this guy talked about that fire is your friend when you're camping. Fire is your friend in the darkness like that, and really how true that was. I also recall that it brought a real sense of comfort just being able to see in the dark like that. And it really helped out quite a bit, knowing what to do, and really helped me get over my fear of camping and really being in the dark like that. I find it interesting how much Jesus spoke about light. Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16, Jesus said this: "You are the light of the world," speaking to his disciples. "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket on the lampstand, and he gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." He's really pointing out how disciples of his are to be lights. Light always, every single time, stands out in darkness. No matter how dim, in the right conditions, it can have a huge influence. Of course, the brighter the light, the greater the influence. We all realize that. But alone, we can have an amazing amount of influence on those around us when we live in our faith in Jesus publicly and privately. I fear that too often we fail to recognize that Jesus calls us beyond the worship service. He calls us beyond the worship service because really what he wants us to do is to be a light in the world. And we can easily recognize the amount of evil in our world. The darkness is deep and quite vast, to be honest, but sometimes it's blatantly obvious, and then other times it's hidden. But the truth of the matter is that this is really nothing new. Jesus still said, "Be a light." So how can we be a light? Well, I think about this, and some obvious things come to mind. I think about Galatians 5 and verse 23, that one of the fruit of the spirits that's mentioned is that we are to practice self-control. Paul says, against such things there is no law. There's no rule, no limit to how much self-control you can practice. That's not always easy, is it? Be a light by showing others that showing love to others, not just those that you like. Jesus said in Matthew 5 and verse 44, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Be a light by showing compassion and mercy. Jesus also said in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13, "Go and learn what this means, that I desire compassion or mercy and not sacrifice. For I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners." When we think about that, what Jesus is really telling us is we need to make sure we have the right heart toward other people. But I also think it's very important, especially in our day and age, for us to be a light by standing up for the injustice or standing up against injustice. Standing up and seeing the things that are wrong in our society and speaking out about the oppression of other people, the weak, the poor, the impoverished. Speak up against racism and things like that we find going on and prevalent in our society. Jesus mentioned this in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23, speaking to the scribes and Pharisees. He said this, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe the mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weighty provisions of the law. Notice, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." Jesus is saying that these people were so hypocritical in what they're doing that they would literally count out a tenth of these tiny garden herbs just to make sure they were following God's law on tithing. Yet Jesus said there were bigger things, bigger matters that they should have given their attention to, such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And I think we need to make sure we do the same things too, that we give attention to the weightier provisions of God's Word. But another thing about light that I find interesting is that a light in the darkness shows the way, but it also gives us a whole lot of hope. If you've ever been in a building or anywhere that's really, really dark and there's a light and someone opens the door and you can see the light in that direction, you very quickly, well, that's the way we need to go. Anytime you go to a movie theater, any big building or any big place like that, there's always these exit signs. They're always lighted up. They always have a battery backup to them in case there's a power outage or something, so you can find your way out. It's clearly marked, and it shows you the way out if you need it. And the thing about it, of course, is that in darkness, a light shows the way out, yes, but it also gives us hope. Are you aware that Jesus said in John chapter 8 and verse 12, Jesus said this concerning himself. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." But notice what he adds to this also. Jesus says, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Think about this for just a minute. He is the one who leads us and shows us the right path. And the closer you are to a light, the greater its influence is upon you. And yet the closer you are to Jesus, the brighter he shines in you and you to others. Jesus, as the light of the world, gives us hope. He leads us to something far greater than ourselves and beyond anything we could ever possibly imagine. Ultimately, he leads us to heaven itself in God's presence. You see, Jesus, he is the light of the world, and as such, he's also the hope of the world. It'd be just as relevant if Jesus said, "I am the hope of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the hope of life." It makes just as much sense and fits just as well, does it not? And as such, when we live out our faith and shine as lights in the world, that even when we find ourselves in our darkest days, Jesus shines bright and he shows us our great hope. Friends, those are some thoughts I had today. I hope you have a great week. Thank you for listening.